She picked up the plate herself. That was the part nobody talked about afterward, not the rancher's cruelty, not the laughter from the bunkhouse. Not the sound her knees made hitting the cold dirt when she bent down to gather the scattered biscuits one by one with her bare hands, while 20 men watched and said nothing. Clara Bennett picked up every piece of that ruined food from the ground, set the broken plate on the fence post, and looked Ethan Caldwell dead in the eye without a single tear falling. "You wasted more than a meal just now," she said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." If this story speaks to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, because where she ends up will surprise you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to this channel, and your support keeps these stories alive. The morning Clara Bennett rode into Broken Pine, Montana territory, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not the soft kind. The deep, angry kind that comes 3 days after the damage is done, when the body finally shows what it's been holding. The kind that makes people look away because it reminds them of something they'd rather forget. She was sitting up on the buckboard seat of a rented wagon she could barely afford, her spine straight as a fence post. Her worn wool coat buttoned all the way to the throat, even though the driver beside her, a gap-toothed old man named Herbert, who'd charged her $4, she didn't have had been sweating through his shirt since they left Billings. Clara didn't unbutton the coat. She'd learned a long time ago that the coat was armor. The coat kept people from seeing too much of her too fast. The coat bought her maybe 30 seconds before the looks started. She had a recipe notebook in her bag. 64 pages, water-stained on the bottom left corner, with her mother's handwriting on the first 40 pages and her own cramped script filling the rest. She had her mother's cast-iron skillet wrapped in a flour sack, a change of clothes, and $11.30 to her name. She had a letter from a woman in Billings named Agnes Holcomb, who had written 3 sentences recommending Clara's cooking, and 1 sentence mentioning, almost as an afterthought, that there might be work at a ranch called Broken Pine if Clara was willing to make the ride. That was everything. That was enough. "That's it," Herbert said, nodding toward a cluster of buildings sitting low against the foothills. Broken Pine. Clara looked. The main house was 2 stories, solid timber, and might have been handsome once. The barn needed paint. The fence line on the eastern pasture had 3 sections down, and nobody had mended them. The yard between the bunkhouse and the main house was just dirt, no gravel, no planks, and the mud from a recent rain had dried in deep ruts that made the whole place look like something walking wounded. There was a kitchen building separate from the main house. She could see the smokestack, dark and cold, even though it was nearly 7 in the morning. No smoke. That told her more than anything else. "Doesn't look like much," Herbert offered helpfully. "It doesn't," Clara agreed. She climbed down from the buckboard herself before Herbert could offer a hand she knew he didn't mean to give. She'd gotten good at that, moving first, moving fast, not giving people the opportunity to decide whether she deserved the courtesy. She landed harder than she'd have liked, her boots sinking an inch into the rut-dried mud, and she straightened up and pulled her bag from the seat and walked toward the main house without looking back. She heard Herbert click his tongue at his horses and turn the wagon around. She kept walking. A man came out of the barn before she reached the porch steps. He was not the rancher. She knew that immediately, not because of how he was dressed, though the worn leather vest and the sun-cracked hands told her he worked the land rather than owned it, but because of the way he moved. Cautious, measuring. The way men who answer to someone else move when a stranger shows up at the wrong hour. He stopped about 10 feet away and looked at her the way people always looked at her. That quick top-to-bottom assessment. She watched his face do what faces always did, the slight flicker, the recalibration, the settling into a careful neutrality that was somehow worse than open judgment because it was dishonest. "Help you?" he said. "I'm here about the cook position," Clara said. "I was told there might be an opening. Who told you that?" "Agnes Holcomb, in Billings." He scratched the back of his neck. "Agnes Holcomb's been dead since spring." Clara didn't blink. "I got the letter in July. The opening may have come about after she wrote it." The man looked at her for a long moment. "Name?" "Clara Bennett." Roy Miller, he said, and didn't offer a hand. I'm the foreman. Mr. Caldwell does all his own hiring. He's in the north pasture right now. You want to wait, you can wait in the yard. Kitchen's not open to visitors. All right, Clara said. She set her bag down by the fence post near the porch steps and stood there. Not sitting. Standing. Roy Miller went back into the barn and she heard him talking in low tones to someone inside, and she couldn't make out the words, but she understood the tone. She'd been understanding that tone her whole life. She waited 40 minutes. She counted them by the movement of the shadow from the smokehouse roof. Ethan Caldwell came in from the north pasture on a gray horse that was better kept than anything else on the property. That told her something, too. He was 40 feet away when she got her first real look at him, and her first thought, which she immediately pushed Ed's down into the same place, she pushed all the thoughts that weren't useful, was that he was the kind of man who used to be something. Not in a tragic way, in a specific way, like a building that was still standing, still solid, but had stopped being tended about 3 years ago, and was only now beginning to show it. He was tall, lean through the shoulders, with dark hair that was going silver at the temples and a jaw that needed a razor. His coat was good quality. It needed mending at the left elbow. He rode well, and he dismounted well, and when he handed the reins to a young ranch hand who appeared from the barn, he did it without looking at the boy, which meant he was already focused on something else. That something else was her. He walked toward her with that particular stride, that men who own land develop, measured, unhurried, not quite arrogant, but carrying the assumption that the world will wait. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at her the same way Roy Miller had, except that Ethan Caldwell didn't bother with the careful neutrality. He just looked. Then he looked at her bag. Then he looked back at her. You're here about the cook job, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Who sent you? Agnes Holcomb gave me a letter in July. Agnes is gone. Yes, sir, I heard. I'm sorry for your loss. She paused. The position may still be open. He didn't answer that directly. Where'd you cook before? Hargrove Family Ranch outside of Bozeman for 2 years. Before that, I worked 3 seasons at a cattle drive camp out of Miles City. Before that, I cooked for a boarding house in Glendive. References? I have a letter from Margaret Hargrove and one from a trail boss named Sam Pickett. Both speak to the quality of the work. She reached into her coat and produced the letters, folded and handled enough times they were soft at the creases. She held them out. He didn't take them. He looked at her hands holding the letters, and then he looked at the rest of her, and she watched him arrive at the decision she'd been watching men arrive at her whole life. That swift, certain, utterly confident conclusion, drawn from information that had nothing to do with cooking. I've got 22 men to feed, he said. 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. Supply runs once a month. The kitchen's in poor shape and the stove needs work. It's hard labor, long hours, I understand. It's not a position for someone who can't handle the pace. The words hit the way they were meant to hit, not quite saying it, never quite saying it. But Clara had been fluent in that language since she was 12 years old, and she heard every word he didn't speak. She looked back at him steady. With respect, Mr. Caldwell, you don't know what I can handle. I can make a reasonable judgment. You can make an assumption, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Something moved across his face. She wasn't sure what it was. Not respect, not yet, maybe not ever, but something. A slight shift, he looked at the letters she was still holding out. He didn't take them. Thank you for writing out, he said. There's a wagon going back to Billings this afternoon from town. I'd suggest you make arrangements. Clara lowered the letters. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Roy Miller standing in the barn doorway and at least 4 ranch hands who had drifted into visible positions around the yard in that way people do when they want to watch something without appearing to watch it. She was aware of her bag on the ground and the cold smokestack and the ruts in the yard mud and the way her feet were planted. She didn't move them. Let me cook 1 meal, she said. Ethan Caldwell frowned. I heard what you told me, Clara said. I'm asking for something different, 1 meal. Tonight's supper. If your men eat it and you decide I'm not right for the work, I'll be on that wagon to Billings this afternoon." No argument, no trouble, she paused. "But let the food decide." "Not your eyes." The yard was quiet. A horse stamped somewhere in the barn. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, the annoyance, the certainty, and underneath both of those, something else. Something that might have been exhaustion, the bone-deep kind. "You've got until supper," he said finally. "Kitchen keys are on the nail by the back door. Roy will show you where the stores are." He looked at Roy without turning his head. "Show her the stores." He walked into the main house without looking at Clara again. Roy came out of the barn and stopped beside her and looked at the main house door for a moment. "Don't read too much into that," he said. "He's turned down 4 cooks in 2 months. Why?" Roy thought about it. "Because he's tired and proud and he doesn't want to need help from anybody." He looked at her bag. "You want me to carry that to the kitchen?" "I've got it," Clara said. She picked up and followed him. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected bad. The stove was an old 6-burner iron range that had 1 broken firebox door and a flue pipe that had separated from the stack at the first joint and been patched with tin and what appeared to be hope. The work table was solid, but the surface was warped from years of uneven heat. There were 2 large cast iron pots. One of them cracked at the base. She'd need to watch that one, use it only for dry storage. The shelves held flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, some tins of molasses, a crate of root vegetables, going soft at the edges, and in the back, hidden behind a sack of cornmeal someone had slid in front of them, 4 good-sized smoked beef shanks wrapped in cheesecloth. She pulled those out and set them on the table and looked at them. "Those were supposed to be used last week," Roy said from the doorway. "Cook before last left without using them. Caldwell didn't know they were back there." "How many men tonight?" 22, like he said. "Plus him if he comes in, which he hasn't done in 3 weeks. He doesn't eat with the men." Roy's expression shifted. "He used to." Clara didn't ask the follow-up question. She'd find out what she needed to find out in time. Right now she had 4 smoked beef shanks, roots, vegetables, flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and 1 reliable burner on a stove that was going to require patience and a specific kind of negotiation. She rolled up her sleeves. "The firewood," she said. "Where's it stacked?" Roy Miller watched her work for about 10 minutes. Then he went and got her the firewood himself. The first thing she did was fix the flue pipe. Not perfectly, she wasn't a tinsmith, but well enough. She found a length of baling wire in the supply shed and refastened the separated joint and packed the gap with ash paste from the bottom of the firebox, which she'd learned from watching a trail cook named Delphine outside of Miles City who could keep a camp stove running through a hailstorm. The flue wouldn't last the winter, but it would last today. The second thing she did was start the beans. Dried beans needed 4 hours minimum, and she had 6 until supper. And the difference between beans cooked long and beans cooked fast was the difference between something that fed people and something that fed people and made them feel fed. She seasoned the water with salt and a piece of that molasses and a bay leaf she found dried and forgotten in a tin on the back shelf, and she set them over the low-heat burner and left them to do their work. Then she broke down the beef shanks. She'd watched her mother do this on a table not unlike this one, in a kitchen not unlike this one, and the motion was so familiar it lived in her hands more than her head. She separated the meat from the bone, rough-cut it for the stew pot, and set the bones in the cracked pot dry, no risk with water and onion, and what whole peppercorns she found at the bottom of a small tin. Bone broth. It would take time, but she had time, and the shank bones from smoked beef made a broth that was worth every minute. She was elbow-deep in the bread dough when the kitchen door opened. It wasn't Roy. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with a sunburned nose and an expression of determined casualness that told Clara he'd been sent by the other men to look but didn't want to admit it. "Something I can help you with," she said without looking up from the dough. "Just checking if you needed anything." He paused. "I'm Jake Turner, Clara Bennett." She pushed the heel of her hand into the dough. "You eat breakfast this morning?" "Yes, ma'am. What'd you have?" He was quiet a moment. "Hardtack and dried meat. Was it good?" Longer pause. "No, ma'am. Then stay out of my kitchen for the next 4 hours," she said, "and tonight will be different." He left. But she heard him talking outside the door, and she heard at least two other voices, and the conversation was short and hushed, and she couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different from the one she'd heard Roy Miller using in the barn. This one had something in it that might have been curiosity. She kept working. At 2 in the afternoon, Roy came back to the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which Clara had already identified as his version of a conciliatory gesture. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right. The last cook, the one before last, she was a fine woman and a decent cook." He stopped. "Mr. Caldwell didn't turn her away because of her cooking." Clara waited. "His wife died 14 months ago," Roy said. "Margaret. She used to run this kitchen herself before she got sick. He kept the kitchen going after tried to, but it was never the same, and eventually he just—" Roy looked at the hat in his hands. "He closed it down, brought in a series of cooks, but none of them lasted more than a week because he couldn't stand being in here, and he couldn't stand the food not being right, and he couldn't stand the way it reminded him." He looked up. "I'm telling you this so you understand. This isn't about your cooking." "I know," Clara said. Roy looked at her. "He made up his mind about me before I opened my bag," she said. "That part I understand." She turned back to the stove. "But I'm still going to cook the best meal this kitchen's made in 14 months. Because 22 men who work hard and eat badly deserve something good. That's got nothing to do with him." Roy put his hat back on. He didn't say anything else. But when she needed the second crate of root vegetables from the supply shed, she found them already sitting outside the kitchen door. The stew came together the way good stew always did, not in a rush, not dramatically, but slowly and with patience, the flavors building on each other in layers she could track by smell alone. The beef had pulled apart the way properly smoked meat does when it's given enough time in liquid, shredding rather than chunking, distributing itself through the pot so every ladle would carry it. She'd used the bone broth as her base and added the beans at the right hour, and the root vegetables at the right hour after that, and the result was something that smelled like it belonged in this kitchen. Like it had always been in this kitchen. Like it was simply returning. She baked 3 pans of bread in the fixed oven, testing the first pan to calibrate the heat, adjusting for the uneven surface, pulling the second and third pans at the right minute. The bread came out dark crusted and soft-centered, and the whole kitchen smelled of it, and she left the window open on purpose because she'd learned a long time ago that smell traveled. At 5:30 she found a crate of dried apple slices behind a barrel of cornmeal, overlooked, but not spoiled, and she had just enough time. Apple dumplings. Simple, not fancy. The kind of thing her mother made in October, the kind of thing that meant the season had turned and winter was coming but not yet. She worked fast, the pastry rough-cut and forgiving, the apples sweetened with molasses and dusted with the last of a small tin of cinnamon she'd found behind the cracked pot. At 6 o'clock she carried the first pot to the mess table herself. The men came in the way starving men do, without ceremony, without particular hope, because hope about food is a thing you lose after enough disappointing meals and rebuild only when something actually earns it back. They sat down at the long table and reached for bread and poured stew into their bowls, and the sound that followed was the sound of men who had expected one thing and received something else entirely. Silence first. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of attention. Jake Turner looked up from his bowl and met Clara's eyes across the room, and he didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, something young and unguarded and honest, and Clara recognized it because she'd seen it before. It was the look of a person who had forgotten, briefly, what it felt like to be cared for through food, and was remembering it right now. "Then Roy Miller," said Lord under his breath. Not a prayer. Just a word with nowhere else to go. Men who hadn't laughed together in months started talking. She could hear it from the kitchen doorway where she stood with a clean cloth over her shoulder, watching without watching, the way good cooks do. She watched Jake Turner tear a piece of bread and hold it up to look at it and then eat it in one bite. She watched an older ranch hand named, she'd learn his name later. She was learning all their names, refill his bowl, without asking, without looking up, without ceremony, just the simple act of a man who wanted more. The dumplings went out at 6:30. She heard the table go quiet again. She heard someone say, "Where did she come from?" She heard Roy Miller say, "Low and dry, Billings." She was washing the first pot when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. She expected Roy. She expected Jake. She expected anyone except the man who was standing in the doorway when she turned around. Ethan Caldwell had a bowl in his hand. Not a full bowl, a half portion, like a man who'd only meant to check on something and then found himself doing something else. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at Clara standing at the wash basin with soapy water to her elbows. And he had the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he hadn't planned to do and doesn't know whether to acknowledge it or retreat. Clara waited. "The men seem to be eating well," he said finally. "Yes, sir." He looked at the bowl in his hand. Then he looked at the stove, at the pots, at the bread pan cooling on the shelf. He looked at it all the way a man looks at something he doesn't recognize that used to be familiar. Then he set the bowl down on the work table without tasting it, turned and walked out. Clara looked at the bowl. She looked at the door he'd closed behind him. She picked up the bowl not to save it, not with any particular feeling, and she carried it back to the wash basin and added it to the pile. The men finished supper at 7. At 7:15, Roy Miller came to the kitchen with his hat in his hand again. "Mr. Caldwell says you can stay on through the month," he said. "Trial period. You'll bunk in the supply room off the kitchen. We'll sort wages on Friday." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me." Roy looked uncomfortable. It wasn't easy. "I know," Clara said. He turned back. "That young man, Jake Turner. Does he have family?" Roy's face did something complicated. "Not anymore." "Lost his mother in March," Clara nodded. She turned back to the wash-in and finished the dishes. She was in the supply room by 9. Her bag unpacked in a space barely big enough to turn around in, her mother's skillet on the one shelf above the cot, the recipe notebook on the floor beside her because there was nowhere else for it. The room smelled of cornmeal and dried herbs and old timber, and through the walls she could hear the low sound of men in the bunkhouse not laughing exactly, but talking, actual conversation. The murmur of people who had something to say to each other. She lay on her back on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Ethan Caldwell's face in the kitchen doorway. She thought about the bowl he'd set down, without tasting. She thought about 14 months of a closed kitchen, and a man who couldn't stand what food reminded him of, and about 22 men who had stopped believing that anything on this ranch was worth staying for. And about a young man named Jake who had lost his mother in March and eaten hardtack for breakfast and whose face, for one unguarded moment over a bowl of beef stew, had looked like a child who remembered what home felt like. She thought about all of that. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep because there was bread to start at 4 in the morning, and the stove needed to be lit by 5, and she had learned, over many years and many difficult mornings, that the most useful thing you could do the night before a hard day was rest. What she didn't know yet, couldn't know, lying in that narrow room with the cornmeal smell and her mother's skillet on the shelf, was that while she slept, 3 things were already in motion that would change every single plan she'd made for herself. The first was Roy Miller sitting at the bunkhouse table after the men went to bed, going through a stack of supply receipts with a lantern and a look on his face that had been there for months and was finally tonight finding something to attach itself to. The second was Jake Turner, lying on his bunk staring at the ceiling in the same way Clara was, except that Jake was 16 years old and had not had a single meal in 4 months that reminded him of the woman he'd lost. And tonight he'd had 2 bowls of stew and a dumpling, and something in his chest that had been locked up since March had cracked open just enough to let a little air in. The third was Ethan Caldwell, sitting at his desk in the main house with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, looking at the empty bowl in front of him, the bowl he'd brought in from the mess table. The half portion he hadn't managed to finish in the kitchen doorway, and eating it cold, alone, in the dark, the way a man eats when he's certain no one is watching, and he needs something he doesn't have a name for anymore. He ate every bite. Then he sat there for a long time with the empty bowl in front of him. And for the first time in 14 months, the silence in that house felt slightly less like the end of something. Clara was back at the stove by 4:15 the next morning. She hadn't needed an alarm. She never did. Her body had kept ranch hours since she was 9 years old, helping her mother feed 12 farmhands in a kitchen half the size of this one. And the habit was so deep now, it lived in her bones the way cold lived in old timber, permanent, structural, not something you could argue with. She built the fire in the firebox first, feeding it slowly the way the old stove demanded, coaxing rather than forcing, because she'd already learned that this particular stove had opinions, and the fastest way to burn a morning was to ignore them. While the heat built, she mixed the bread dough she'd started the night before leaving it to rise in the covered bowl on the shelf above the stove's warmth, which was a trick her mother had taught her that every ranch cook she'd ever met had either discovered themselves or refused to believe until they tried it. She was shaping the loaves when she heard boots on the kitchen steps. Not Roy's heavy, deliberate tread, not Jake's young man shuffle. These were boots that knew the ground they were walking on, that had been walking it for years, and they stopped outside the kitchen door without coming in. She kept shipping the bread. The boots stood there for a moment. Then they walked away. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew whose they were. By the time the men came in for breakfast at 6, she had bread on the table, a pot of oats cooked with molasses and dried apple, and a cast-iron skillet full of fried salt pork that she'd rendered slowly enough that it had gone crisp instead of chewy. It wasn't a complicated meal. It wasn't meant to be. But every piece of it was done right, and done right is the difference between food and something else, something that tells people they matter, that someone thought about them before they sat down. Jake Turner was first through the door. He stopped when he smelled the oats. "That's got apple in it," he said. "Dried apple," Clara said from the stove. "Found another crate in the back. Sit down before it goes cold." He sat down. He didn't say much more through breakfast, but he refilled his bowl twice, and he helped carry the empty pots back to the kitchen without being asked, setting them by the wash basin and wiping his hands on his pants, and giving Clara a look that was trying hard to be casual and wasn't. "My mother used to put cinnamon in her oats," he said. "I would have," Clara told him, "but I'm almost out. I'll put it on the supply list." Jake looked at her. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, and he nodded once and walked out. Roy Miller was the last man through the door at breakfast, and he sat at the end of the table and ate methodically and thoroughly the way men do when they're thinking hard about something else. And when he was done, he brought his bowl to the kitchen himself and set it on the work table and stood there. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "About the supply list?" Clara said. "Because I've been meaning to, not the supply list." Roy looked at the door, then back at her. "About the supply costs." Clara stopped moving. Roy pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and set it on the work table beside his bowl. She looked at it without picking it up. "That's the invoice from our last 3 deliveries," Roy said. "All 3 from the same supplier out of Billings. Man named Holt." He paused. "You're a cook. You know what things cost." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the paper. She read it. She read it again. "This flour," she said. "This price, I know. Roy, this is almost double what flour costs in Billings right now." "I know that. And this cornmeal." She moved her finger down the column. "And this," she stopped. "Roy, these prices are wrong by a factor that isn't a mistake." "No," Roy said, "it isn't." She set the paper down and looked at him. "How long?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "Best I figured, 2 years. Maybe a little more." The number sat between them in the warm kitchen air. "Does Ethan know?" "Ethan trusts Holt," Roy said. "They've known each other since before Margaret got sick. Holt helped them through a bad season 5 years ago, extended credit when nobody else would. Ethan's got loyalty to the man that goes deeper than he thinks." Roy looked at the paper. "He's not going to want to hear this. That's not a reason to stay quiet." "No," Roy agreed. "But it's a reason to be careful about how you bring it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not the one to bring it. He'll hear it differently coming from me." I'm just the foreman. He'll think I'm overstepping. Clara understood what Roy wasn't saying. You want me to bring it, she said. I want it to be brought, Roy said carefully. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you what I know, because you asked about the supply list, and because you're the one who's going to be ordering from Holt next week, and you deserve to know what you're dealing with. He picked up his hat from the work table. And because, he added, without quite looking at her, you seem like the kind of woman who knows how to find things out and what to do with them when she does. He left. Clara stood in the kitchen with the invoice in her hand. She set it on the shelf above the stove, behind the flour tin where she could see it. Then she went back to work. She was not a woman who acted without understanding. She had learned that from the same years that had taught her everything else about surviving in spaces that didn't want her, that rushing at a problem from the front was almost never the right approach when you didn't yet know the full shape of it. So she cooked, she served, she watched. She listened the way she'd always listened, with her whole body and not just her ears, picking up what people said and what they didn't say, and what the gap between those two things told her. What it told her over the next 10 days was considerable. She learned that Gerald Holt came to Broken Pine once a month for the supply delivery and stayed for dinner and a drink with Ethan in the main house, and that the ranch hands went quiet when his wagon pulled up and noisy again when he left, and that the specific quality of the quiet was not respect. She learned that the invoices she'd found were not the only invoices that Roy had a second stack in his room, 3 years deep, that he'd been saving without knowing what to do with them. She asked him to let her look at them, and he brought them to the kitchen that same night, and she spread them across the work table after supper, and spent 2 hours with the ranch's account ledger, which Roy had liberated from Ethan's desk on the basis that the foreman had a legitimate need for it, and compared numbers until her eyes ached. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Gerald Holt had been overcharging Broken Pine Ranch for staple supplies at a rate that varied between 60 and 90% above market price. And the overcharges had been consistent enough and varied enough to look like normal price fluctuation to someone who wasn't looking closely. And Ethan hadn't been looking closely. Why would he? He'd known Holt for years. Holt had come through when things were hard. Loyalty didn't audit its own receipts. Clara wrote everything down in a separate notebook, not her recipe book, a plain one she'd bought in town on her second week, in 2 columns. What was paid? What should have been paid? The difference column, running down the right side of the page, grew longer every line. On the 11th day, Jake Turner found her in the kitchen after supper, working on the notebook by lantern light. What's that? He said. Record keeping, Clara said. Jake came closer and looked at the columns. He was sharper than his age, suggested she'd learned that about him, the way he tracked conversations and filed things away, and drew conclusions faster than most grown men she'd worked with. He looked at the columns for less time than she'd expected before he looked up at her. Is that Holt? Clara looked at him. Roy talks in his sleep, Jake said. Not words exactly, but he says Holt's name. He looked back at the notebook. How bad is it? Jake's jaw tightened. He was 19 years old, and he'd been on this ranch for 2 years, and he cared about it the way young men care about the first place that gives them ground to stand on. She watched him process the numbers and watched his face go through something she recognized, the particular sequence of disbelief to anger, to a steady, cold clarity that was harder and more useful than either. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to finish building the case, Clara said. And then I'm going to present it. To Caldwell. Yes. Jake was quiet. He's not going to like it. I know. He might blame you for going through the records. I know that too. Jake looked at her for a long moment. You're going to do it anyway. Yes, Clara said. He nodded once, the same nod he'd given her over the oats. Something settled in it. I'll back you up, he said. Whatever you need, I'll back you up. Clara set down her pen. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't have to. Jake's voice was level. I want to. This ranch is worth fighting for, and so are you. He went back to the bunkhouse. Clara sat with the lantern and the notebook and the running column of numbers on the right side of the page. She thought about what Roy had said. About loyalty that went deeper than logic. About a man who'd extended credit in a bad year and collected on it for 3 years in a manner that had nothing to do with repayment and everything to do with exploitation. About Ethan Caldwell sitting at his desk in the main house with a cold bowl of stew, eating alone in the dark. She picked up her pen and kept working. The breaking point came 13 days into her trial month, and it didn't come the way she'd planned it. Gerald Holt arrived at Broken Pine on a Tuesday a week early. He drove his wagon into the yard at midday, with a load of supplies and a smile that Clara watched from the kitchen doorway with a very specific kind of attention. She'd learned to read men like Holt the same way she'd learned to read uneven stoveplates by where the heat was distributed unevenly. The smile was for Ethan, who came out of the main house to meet him. The eyes were scanning, measuring, calculating, the same as always, but quicker than usual. Something had changed. She'd find out what in about 20 minutes. She turned back to the kitchen and kept her hands busy and her mind open. The wagon was unloaded by the ranch hands she watched from the kitchen window without being obvious about it, cataloging what came off the wagon against what she'd put on the order list Roy had given Holt 3 weeks prior. She kept a running count in her head. When the wagon was empty, she had a number. The number was wrong. 13 items on the order, 11 items delivered, invoice when she found it later on the supply room shelf where Holt always left it charging for all 13. She sat with that for a moment. Then she took the invoice off the shelf and walked to the main house and knocked on the door. Ethan opened it himself. Behind him, she could see Holt sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey, and the look on Holt's face when he saw her standing in the doorway with the invoice in her hand was not a look she would forget. It was the look of a man who had, up until that exact moment, assumed he was dealing with a cook who wouldn't know the difference. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said, with a note in his voice that said this was not a good time. "I apologize for interrupting," Clara said. "I need 1 minute of your time." "It's about the delivery. Can it wait?" "No, sir," Clara said. "It can't." Something in her voice, not loud, not aggressive, just absolutely certain, made Ethan step back from the door. She walked in. She set the invoice on the table between Ethan and Holt and pulled her notebook from her apron pocket and opened it to the delivery count page. 13 items on the order, she said. 11 delivered. The invoice charges for all 13. She looked at Ethan. "I thought you'd want to know before you settled up." The room was very quiet. Holt picked up the invoice. His face had gone through 2 or 3 expressions in quick succession and landed on something that was trying to be jovial and wasn't quite getting there. "Well now," he said, "that's likely just an oversight on my end." "The flour," Clara said without raising her voice. "The salt pork, not on the wagon." She looked at Holt. "I counted myself. Twice." Holt looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the invoice. "Gerald," he said, "where's the flour?" "Must have gotten left behind at the depot," Holt said. "Easy enough to sort out. I'll send it out next week." "And charge for it again?" Clara said. The room went even quieter. Holt put the invoice down. His voice when he spoke had lost the jovial quality entirely. "I don't think the cook's job runs to auditing supply deliveries," he said. He was talking to Ethan, not to Clara, which was a choice she noted. "Ethan, this woman's been here, 2 weeks? And she's coming in here making accusations." "I made an observation," Clara said. "The invoice is the accusation." "Ethan, how much was the flour?" Holt blinked. "What on the invoice? How much did you charge me for the flour that isn't in my supply room?" Clara turned to the notebook page she'd already prepared. $4.60, she said, which is incidentally about double the current billings price. The silence this time had a different quality. Ethan looked at her notebook. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the empty bowl in the kitchen, like a man seeing something he hadn't expected to see, having a realization he hadn't planned on having. "Where'd you get those prices?" he said. "The Billings Commercial Register," Clara said. "They publish monthly. Roy had the last 4 issues in the bunkhouse." Holt stood up from the table. "Ethan, I've been supplying this ranch for 5 years," he said. 5 years. Through drought, through Margaret's illness, through every hard season you've had. And you're going to let some woman who's been here 3 weeks. Sit down, Gerald, Ethan said. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was the voice of a man who had just heard something he needed to be quiet in order to understand. Holt sat down. Ethan held out his hand toward Clara's notebook. She hesitated one moment, not from doubt, but from the knowledge that this was the moment. That everything after this would be different from everything before it, and that different did not always mean better, and that sometimes doing the right thing was indistinguishable from walking off a cliff in the dark. She gave him the notebook. Ethan read. He read for a long time. Clara stood across the table and watched Eggface and did not look at Holt and did not move and barely breathed. When Ethan finally set the notebook down on the table, he kept his hand flat on it, palm down, like he was holding it in place. Gerald, he said quietly, you want to explain column 3. Holt's face had gone through something ugly in the time Ethan had been reading, and it had settled into a kind of defiant anger that Clara recognized as the expression of a man who had been comfortable for a long time and was only now cornered, revealing what that comfort had been built on. I don't have to explain anything to a cook, Holt said. No, Ethan said, you have to explain it to me. Holt stood again. His voice had gone hard. You know what your problem is, Ethan. You've always been too soft. Too trusting. And now you're trusting a woman who doesn't know this business, who doesn't know what it costs to supply a ranch this distance from Billings, who doesn't know a thing about... Does she know your handwriting, Ethan said. Holt stopped. Ethan turned to the back pages of Clara's notebook, where she had calmly, thoroughly, over the course of 11 nights, transferred the key figures from Roy's collection of invoices in Holt's own handwriting, with dates running back 2.5 years. These are your numbers, Gerald, Ethan said. In your hand. The room was completely silent. Clara watched Holt calculate. She watched him weigh options and find them insufficient one by one, the way a man does when a trap closes around him, that he can't argue his way out of because the evidence is in his own handwriting, and the man across the table from him is not, in this moment, the trusting, grief-hollowed friend he'd been exploiting. I want you off my property, Ethan said. Today. He stood up from the table, and he was taller than she'd realized, or maybe it was just the posture. The posture of a man who had been hunching under a weight he hadn't known he was carrying and had just set it down. I'll be sending copies of these records to the county sheriff and to the commercial bank in Billings. I'd suggest you have your own records in order. Holt looked at Clara. The look was not one she'd want to receive in a dark alley, and she filed it away without reacting to it. He picked up his hat from the table and walked out. The door closed behind him. Clara and Ethan stood on opposite sides of the table with her notebook between them. Ethan looked at the notebook, then he looked at Clara. You've been working on this since your first week, he said. Since the end of the first week, she said, when Roy showed me the invoices. Roy gave you access to my supply records. Roy showed me invoices he'd been keeping himself for 3 years, Clara said. He didn't know what to do with them. I did. Ethan was quiet. You should have come to me, he said, when you first saw the numbers. Yes, Clara said, I should have, and I want to tell you why I didn't. She met his eyes directly. Because I had been in this house for 1 week. Because you hired me on sufferance and made clear you could change your mind at any moment. Because Gerald Holt has 5 years of your trust and I had 5 days. I needed the full picture before I could give it to you. Because I knew you wouldn't believe me on 5 days. Ethan looked at her for a long time. You were right, he said finally. About that. He paused. I wouldn't have believed you on 5 days. He picked up her notebook and held it out to her. She took it. Thank you, he said. It sounded like it cost him something. Yes, sir, Clara said. She turned toward the door. Miss Bennett. She stopped. The stove in the kitchen, Ethan said. Roy tells me you patched the flue yourself the first morning. It needed doing. There's a tinsmith in town. I'll have him out to do it properly. Another silence. The bread this morning, Ethan said. Was there rosemary in it? Clara turned halfway, dried rosemary. I found it in a tin on the back shelf. I hope that was all right. Ethan looked at the table for a moment. My wife grew rosemary, he said. Behind the kitchen, she used it in her bread. Clara held very still. It's probably overgrown by now, Ethan said, to no one in particular. I don't know if it's still there. I'll look, Clara said quietly. And if it is, I'll tend it. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table for a moment with her hand flat on the surface, very much the way Ethan had held his hand flat on the notebook, and she took one breath and then another, and then she started on supper. When she looked out the back window of the kitchen, she could see the corner of the house where a kitchen garden would logically be. She could see, even from here, the sprawling, feathery gray-green of a rosemary plant that had not been tended in 14 months but had survived anyway. As things sometimes did when the roots went deep enough. Roy Miller came to the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was trying to be neutral and failing completely. He said, I know. Caldwell's been in his study since noon. Nobody's gone in, I know that too. Roy looked at the rosemary sprig she'd brought in from the garden and set in a jar water on the shelf. He looked at it for a long moment. You found Margaret's garden, he said. I did. Roy put his hat back on. She'd have liked you, he said. Margaret would have liked you a great deal. He walked away before she could respond, which was probably just as well, because she didn't have anything to say to that wouldn't have given too much away about the state of things behind her eyes. She cut the rosemary fine and added it to the bread. She made supper. At the mess table that night, 22 men ate together for the first time in months with something in the room that hadn't been there before, not just the food, not just the warmth, but the particular quality of air that comes into a space when people believe, even briefly, that things might actually get better. That the ground under them might be solid after all. Jake Turner sat across from Roy Miller, and at one point he said something quiet that made Roy actually laugh, not the dry sound he usually made, but a real one, and the sound of it moved through the room like something loosening. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. She was not naive. She knew what was still ahead. She knew that Roy had 3 years of records that told a story Ethan's bankers and the county sheriff were going to need to hear, and that the hearing was not going to be comfortable. She knew that Gerald Holt's parting look had been the look of a man who did not consider the matter finished. She knew that Ethan Caldwell was sitting alone in his study right now, and that whatever was happening in there, pride and grief, and the specific humiliation of having been deceived by someone he'd trusted, were all in the room with him. And that none of those things resolved quickly or cleanly. She knew all of it. She also knew that 22 men were eating bread made with rosemary from a garden that had been left to grow wild for 14 months, and that somewhere in the main house a light was still on in the study window, and that a man was sitting under it who had, tonight, looked at evidence he hadn't wanted to see and believed it anyway. That was something. That was, she thought, the beginning of something. She went back to the kitchen and started the dishes and tried to remember that beginnings were supposed to be slow, that patience was not the same as passivity, that the roots of things that survived were always the ones that went deepest. She tried to remember all of that. She mostly succeeded. But when she passed the shelf above the stove on her way to the wash basin, she touched the jar with the rosemary sprig in it just briefly, just with the tips of 2 fingers, and let herself feel, for one quiet moment, the particular ache of hoping. The sheriff came to Broken Pine on a Thursday. His name was Dale Whitmore, and he rode in with a deputy and a leather satchel, and the particular expression of a man who had heard 2 very different versions of the same story and had not yet decided which one to believe. He tied his horse at the post by the main house and knocked on the door, and Ethan let him in. And Clara knew all of this because Jake Turner reported it to her in the kitchen with the precise detail of someone who had positioned himself near the main house window with a very plausible reason to be there, involving a fence latch that needed checking. 3 horses, Jake said, setting a bucket down by the wash basin. Whitmore, his deputy, and a man I don't recognize, wearing a suit, came from town, not from the road. Clara kept her hands in the bread dough. What kind of suit? The kind that costs money and doesn't know what work looks like. Jake looked at her. Holtz? Most likely. Jake was quiet for a moment. That was fast. Yes, Clara said. It was. She shaped the loaves without speaking and put them in the oven and washed her hands and untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. Where are you going? To get Roy, Clara said. She found Roy Miller in the barn doing something with a bridle that he was clearly not actually doing. His hands were moving, but his eyes were on the main house door. He turned when she came in, and she could see from his face that he already knew. Whitmore's here, she said. I saw. There's a third man. Suit. Roy set the bridle down. Holt moved fast. He had 3 years to prepare for the possibility, Clara said. We've had Roy. The invoices. The full set. Are they somewhere Ethan can get to them quickly? They're in a box in my room. I was going to bring them to Ethan yesterday, but Roy stopped. He's been in the study, Clara said. Since Tuesday, Roy picked up his hat. He came out for meals twice. Didn't eat much either time. He's going through things. Account books, correspondence. I don't know what all. He looked at her steadily. He hasn't asked for the invoices. He will now, Clara said. Go get them. Roy went. Clara went back to the kitchen and checked the bread and started the midday meal, and kept her mind on the work the way you kept a horse on a path, not by force, but by consistent, deliberate direction. She had learned that panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and that the best thing you could do when something large and potentially damaging was happening outside your control was to do the things inside your control as well as you possibly could. She baked good bread. She waited. At 11 in the morning, the main house door opened, and Ethan came out onto the porch and stood there for a moment, and then looked directly at the kitchen. He didn't call for her, he didn't wave. He just looked, and then he went back inside, and Clara took off her apron and walked across the yard. The main house felt different when she walked in. The lawyer, a thin man named Fitch, with a pale indoor complexion and hands that had never pulled a rope, was sitting at the table with his satchel open and papers arranged in front of him with the careful architecture of a man who used documents as weapons and wanted them within reach. Whitmore was by the window. His deputy was by the door. Roy had arrived before Clara and was standing against the wall with the box of invoices in his arms, and the look on his face was the look of a man who was ready. Ethan stood at the head of the table. He looked at Clara when she came in, and the look was not the look he'd given her on the first day, or even the look from the study 2 days ago. It was something steadier, something that had made a decision. Miss Bennett, Fitch said before Ethan could speak. His voice was calibrated to the precise pitch of a man who considers himself the most credible person in any room he enters. I understand you're the cook here, I am, Clara said. And it was you who presented Mr. Caldwell with certain allegations regarding Mr. Holt's business practices. I presented Mr. Caldwell with documented records of supply invoices alongside current market prices, Clara said. The allegations, as you call them, are what the numbers themselves make. Fitch smiled the way a man smiles when he's decided the person he's talking to is not a serious obstacle. Miss Bennett, with respect, you are a cook. Your expertise, I'm sure, runs to recipes and meal preparation. Supply chain pricing, market fluctuation, the complexities of freight costs between Billings and a remote ranch property. These are matters that require a considerably more sophisticated understanding than... Column 3, Clara said. Fitch stopped. Page 12 of my notebook, Clara said. She pulled it from her apron pocket. She'd put the apron back on. She realized, without thinking, the same way she'd pocketed it in the first place. Some habits were useful. Freight costs from Billings to properties at comparable distances from the city. I pulled figures from 3 other ranch supply contracts that Roy had in his files from previous suppliers. The freight differential accounts for approximately 12% of the price variation. The remaining 50 to 78% has no corresponding explanation. The room was quiet. Whitmore turned from the window. You pulled 3 comparative contracts, he said. Yes, where'd you get those? Roy Miller's files, she said. The ranch kept copies of previous supply agreements. It's... Whitmore looked at Roy. Roy nodded once. Fitch picked up one of his own papers. Mr. Holt's position is that pricing variations reflect the unique logistical challenges of supplying broken pine specifically, and that Miss Bennett's figures represent a fundamental misunderstanding. Show me his freight invoices, Clara said. Fitch looked at her. If the price difference is freight, Clara said, he'll have freight invoices to support it. Every legitimate supplier keeps them. Show me his and I'll show you mine, and we'll let Sheriff Whitmore look at both. The room was very quiet. Whitmore was looking at Fitch with the expression of a man whose job had just become simpler. Fitch gathered his papers with the precise controlled movements of a man choosing a new strategy while the previous one was still warm. I'll need to consult with my client, he said. That's fine, Ethan said. It was the first time he'd spoken since Clara came in, and his voice was completely level. You do that. Roy, give the sheriff the invoice box. Roy set the box on the table. Fitch looked at the box. He looked at it the way Holt had looked at Clara's notebook in this same room 2 days ago, the look of a man recalculating what kind of trouble he was actually in. Ethan, he said, dropping the formal posture, think about what you're doing here. Gerald's been a friend of this family for years. You're going to let a woman who's been in your kitchen 3 weeks. 23 days, Jake said. Every head in the room turned. Jake Turner was standing in the doorway. He had not been there a moment ago. His hat was in his hands and his jaw was set, and he was looking at Fitch with the steady, uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet learned to perform deference. She's been here 23 days, Jake said. And in 23 days she fixed the stove, found the rosemary garden, fed 22 men 3 meals a day, and figured out what Roy couldn't figure out in 3 years, because nobody gave him the right framework. He looked at Ethan. Begging your pardon, Mr. Caldwell, but he called her just a cook, and I didn't think that was right. Ethan looked at Jake for a long moment. It isn't, Ethan said. Jake nodded. He stepped back out of the doorway. Fitch closed his satchel. He left with the deputy and with considerably less Pat's confidence than he'd arrived with, and Whitmore stayed behind with the invoice box and spent an hour with Roy going through figures, asking questions, writing things in a small leather notebook in a precise, careful hand. Clara answered questions when he directed them to her, which he did 3 times, each time with the particular courtesy of a man recalibrating his initial assessment. Before he left, Whitmore stood at the door and looked at Clara. You put this together yourself, he said. Roy gathered the invoices, Clara said. I did the comparative analysis. 11 nights, Roy said, from the wall. By lantern, after supper cleanup. Whitmore looked at the kitchen across the yard. All right, he said. He put his hat on.
I'll be in touch with Mr.
Caldwell by end of week. He left. The main house was quiet. Ethan sat down at the table for the first time since the meeting started. He sat heavily, the way a man sits when something is over, and the weight of it is only now fully arriving. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Roy looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ethan. I'll get back to the kitchen, she said. Clara. Ethan said her name, not Miss Bennett, Clara. It was the first time, and she felt the shift of it. I owe you an apology. Not just for Holt. He looked up. For the first day. For what I said to you. He stopped. He was not a man who found apology easy, she could see that. It wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was more like he'd spent a long time not having to give them and had lost the musculature for it. I judged you wrong. I judged you before you opened your mouth. Before you touched a pot, and I've been watching you for 3 weeks work harder and see clearer and care more about this ranch than people who've been here for years. He held her gaze. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for it. Clara stood with her notebook in her hand in the middle of the room and felt the particular sensation of something she had been braced against for a long time no longer pushing. I appreciate that, she said. Do you accept it? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. I do. Roy made a sound that might have been relief. "There's one more thing," Ethan said. He pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position, not just cook. Supply manager. Kitchen and stores. You'd have authority over ordering, inventory, supplier relations." He set the paper on the table. "I had Roy write up the terms this morning. The wage is fair. I'd ask you to look it over." Clara walked to the table and picked up the paper. She read it. The wage was more than fair, it was generous. She looked up. "This is more than the position warrants," she said. "It's what the position is worth," Ethan said. "When the person doing it is worth it." Clara folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket. "I'll think on it," she said. Ethan blinked. She could see he'd expected yes. She watched him reassemble his expectations. "Of course," he said. "Take whatever time you need." She went back to the kitchen. The bread was done. She pulled it from the ovens and set it to cool, and started on the midday meal, and did not let herself think about the paper in her apron pocket until her hands had something useful to do. Because she had learned that big decisions made with idle hands were almost always worse than the same decisions made while you were doing something that grounded you. By the time she was ladling soup at noon, she had thought it through 3 times and arrived at the same answer each time, which was usually how she knew an answer was real. She let the men eat. She let Jake have seconds, which he always needed and never asked for without being invited. She let Roy take the heel of the bread loaf, which she'd noticed 3 weeks ago was his preference, and which she'd begun leaving for him without comment. Then she walked back to the main house and knocked. Ethan opened the door. "I'll take the position," Clara said. "But I have a condition." He held the door wider. "Come in." She came in. She stood on the Cicero she'd stood during the meeting with Fitch and Whitmore, because the position felt right, and she was a woman who knew about positions. "I want to order from a new supplier," she said. "I've already written to 3 operations in Billings with clean reputations. I want to open the bidding, get comparative quotes, and choose based on price and reliability. No handshakes. Written contracts only. And I want to review every invoice before payment goes out." Ethan sat down across from her. "Done," he said. "And the kitchen garden," Clara said. "Not for aesthetics. For cost reduction. Herbs, root vegetables, whatever the growing season will support. It reduces our dependency on outside suppliers for staples and gives us some buffer when prices run high." "That's sensible," Ethan said. "And I want to bring Jake Turner onto the kitchen crew part-time," Clara said. "He's wasted on fence repair. He's sharp and he cares and he'll learn fast." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Jake's been here 2 years," he said. "He's a good hand. He's a good everything," Clara said. "Give him a chance at something bigger." Ethan looked at her the way she'd been looked at, a few times now in this house, with the particular attention of a man who was revising something. "You care about these people," he said. "They're good people," Clara said. "They deserve someone who does." Ethan was quiet. Then he said, "There's something I want to show you." He led her through the main house to a room at the back that she hadn't been in, a small room off the kitchen entry that had a door to the outside yard and a second door she hadn't noticed before, leading to a space with a window that faced the kitchen garden. The room was empty except for a work table and some shelving units and a window with the glass intact and clean. "Margaret used this as her office," Ethan said, "when she was managing the kitchen and the garden. She kept her records here." He paused. "It's yours if you want it. For the supply work. It's close enough to the kitchen that you won't lose time and you'll have space to work properly." Clara looked at the room. She looked at the window facing the garden with the overgrown rosemary visible from where she stood. "Yes," she said quietly, "I want it." That afternoon, while Clara organized the office and began drafting letters to the 3 billing suppliers, Gerald Holt rode back into the yard. He came alone this time. No wagon, no supplies. Just Holt on a dark horse with his hat at low, and an expression that Clara from the office window identified immediately and felt go cold in her chest. He did not go to the main house. He went to the bunkhouse. Clara waited exactly 30 seconds. Then she walked out of the office and crossed the yard to the bunkhouse and opened the door without knocking. Holt was inside, standing in front of 4 ranch hands who'd come in from the midday break, and his voice, which she'd been able to hear, rising in pitch and urgency from 20 feet away, cut off when the door opened. He looked at her. "Miss Bennett," he said, with a smile that had nothing behind it. "This is a private conversation." "In my employer's bunkhouse," Clara said. "With my employer's workers." She looked at the 4 ranch hands. "Everything all right, boys?" None of them spoke, but the youngest one, a kid named Pete, barely 17, was looking at the floor, which told her more than speaking would have. "Mr. Holt was just explaining," said the oldest of the 4, a weathered man named Cal, "that things look different than they seem, and that there's 2 sides to every story, and that people who make trouble for others sometimes find trouble coming back." "Was he?" she said. "It was a friendly conversation," Holt said. His voice had gone smooth in the way voices go smooth, when they're covering something with a surface that won't hold. "I've known these men a long time, longer than you've been here." You've got a right to leave this property," Clara said. "Mr. Caldwell made that clear on Tuesday. If you're back on Broken Pine Land, I'll be getting him right now." She did not raise her voice. She did not move toward him. She just stood in the doorway, with her hand on the frame, and looked at Gerald Holt with exactly as much fear as she felt, which was none, and exactly as much anger as was useful, which was a controlled and specific amount. Holt looked at the 4 men. He looked at Clara. He put his hat back on. "You've made an enemy today," he said, not loudly. Quiet enough that it was meant only for her. "I made one on Tuesday," Clara said. "This is just the same one showing up twice." He walked out. She stepped aside to let him through the door, and watched him mount his horse and ride off the property without looking back. Cal let out a breath. "Lord," he said. "He was trying to get you to sign something," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Cal looked at her with an expression of resigned respect. "Paper saying we'd witnessed the invoices and knew the prices were fair. He said it would protect us from getting pulled into the sheriff's investigation. And if you'd signed it." "I reckon it would have done the opposite," Cal said. "Yes," Clara said, "it would have." She went to find Ethan. She found him in the north pasture with 2 hands checking the fence line, and she walked out to him across the dry grass, one with her skirt getting dusty at the hem, and she told him quickly and without preamble what had happened. She watched his face go from surprise to anger in the space of about 4 seconds, and then go very still. "He came back," Ethan said. "Yes. He tried to get my men to sign documents." "Yes." Ethan was quiet. He looked at the fence line and then at the sky and then at Clara. "Are they all right?" he said. "They're fine. They didn't sign." "Because of you. Because they're smart men who knew something was wrong," Clara said. "I just walked in before he could pressure them long enough." Ethan looked at her. "I'm sending a rider to Whitmore today," he said. "That's the right call. And I want a man watching the road tonight." He looked back at the fence line. "Roy'll know who to put on it." Clara nodded. She turned to go. "Clara." She turned back. Ethan was looking at her with the expression she'd seen building over the past week, a careful, complicated thing that had layers to it. And she had been very deliberate about not examining those layers too closely, because some doors were worth taking your time at. "You walked into that bunkhouse alone," he said. "Yes." "Holt's not a safe man to cross. I know that. You went anyway." "Yes," Clara said simply. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know whether to thank you or be angry," he said. "You could do both," Clara said, in that order. She walked back across the dry grass to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Ethan say something to the ranch hands with him low. She couldn't make it out, and then she heard one of them laugh. A short, surprised sound, like a man who hadn't expected the moment to have room for that. The rider went to Whitmore that evening. Whitmore sent a letter back by morning. The letter said that Gerald Holt's freight records had been requested and had not been produced. The letter said that 3 separate ranches in the county had come forward in the past 48 hours with similar supply discrepancies involving Holt going back as far as 4 years. The letter said that a formal investigation was now underway. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with her morning coffee before the ranch was awake. She set it down. She thought about Gerald Holt riding up to this kitchen in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in any of the coming years. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he said, "You've made an enemy." She thought about what he'd expected when he walked into this yard 6 weeks ago and found a new cook, what kind of woman he'd expected, what kind of obstacle, and how spectacularly he'd miscalculated. She thought about Roy's stack of invoices sitting unacted on for 3 years because no one had given him the framework. She thought about Jake's face over the bowl of stew on the first night. She thought about Ethan eating cold stew alone in the dark. She got up and started the bread. By the time the men came in for breakfast, the kitchen was warm and the bread was done. And something that had been shifting in the bones of the ranch for 6 weeks had shifted all the way through. And everyone who walked through the kitchen door that morning could feel it, not in any way they could have named, but in the specific and unmistakable manner of people who have been cold a long time and have walked into a room where the fire has been burning steadily and with intention. Jake Turner came in last and looked at Clara with the same look he'd had since the first night, that young, honest, unperformed thing, and he said, "You look tired." "I'm fine," Clara said. "You look like you haven't slept." "I slept enough." Jake pulled his bowl toward him and looked at it and looked back at her. "Is it over?" Clara thought about the letter on the kitchen table. She thought about Holt and his unproduced freight records. She thought about 3 other ranches. "It's turning," she said. Jake thought about that. "Is that the same as over?" "No," Clara said, "but it's better than where it was." He nodded. He ate his breakfast. And Clara stood at the stove and felt the particular sensation of something large and complicated moving in a better direction under the pressure of patient, unglamorous daily effort, the same way bread rose, the same way a stove heated evenly once the flue was fixed slowly, and with the specific stubborn persistence of things that had been tended with care. What she couldn't see yet, standing at that stove on a cold October morning with flour on her hands and Roy's letter on the table, was that the worst of it was still ahead. That Gerald Holt, cornered and calculating, had one more move to make, a move that wouldn't come for another week, and that when it came, it would not come quietly, and it would not come at her alone. It would come at the one thing she had not thought to protect. Because she had been protecting everything else. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It didn't come through the sheriff. It didn't come through a lawyer. It came through the regular post addressed to Ethan Caldwell in a hand Clara didn't recognize. And it sat on the desk in the main house for half a day before Ethan opened it, and another half day before he came to the kitchen with it in his hand, and a look on his face that she had not seen before. She had seen him tired. She had seen him proud and ashamed and quietly undone by rosemary bread. She had not seen him look like this, like a man who had just been handed a problem he didn't know how to carry, and was standing in her doorway because he didn't know where else to go with it. "Sit down," she said before he spoke. He sat. She poured coffee and set it in front of him and waited. He put the letter on the table between them. She picked it up and read it. It was from the Commercial Bank of Billings. 3 paragraphs. Formal and precise and devastating in the specific way that bank letters are devastating, not because of what they say with heat, but because of what they say without any heat at all. As though the ruin of a man's livelihood is simply a matter of columns and dates and the ordinary functioning of agreed-upon terms. The ranch carried debt. She had known that Roy had mentioned it in passing in the first week, and she'd understood from the state of the property that things had been tight for years. What she had not known, what the letter made plain in its 3 bloodless paragraphs, was the size of it. 6 years of compounding interest on a loan taken during the drought year, a loan that had been restructured twice, a loan that had a balloon payment coming due in 45 days. She set the letter down. She looked at the number at the bottom of the 2nd paragraph. "The money Whitmore is recovering from Holt," she said. "How much of this does it cover?" Ethan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "About a third. And the ranch income between now and the due date?" "If we sell the eastern herd at current prices," he paused. "Another quarter." Clara did the arithmetic in her head. It was not complicated, it was just brutal. That still leaves. I know what it leaves, Ethan said. She was quiet. I've been trying to solve it since Margaret got sick, Ethan said. The drought took 2 good years. Then the medical costs. Then the bad supply contracts. Then he stopped. He looked at the coffee cup. I kept thinking I had more time than I did. Clara looked at the letter. She thought about Holt. She thought about 2 years of inflated invoices draining the ranch at the exact period when it could least absorb the drain. She thought about how precise the timing of it was, not accidental, not incidental, but targeted at a man who was already down. No. Jake? No one knows, Ethan said. Just the bank. And now you. He looked at her when he said it, and she understood what was in that look. Not just the sharing of information. Something else. The specific act of choosing who to tell, which was the same as choosing who to trust, and she recognized what that cost a man like Ethan Caldwell and did not treat it lightly. All right, she said. All right, he repeated like a question. We're going to figure this out, Clara said. Clara. I'm not saying it's easy, she said. I'm saying we're going to figure it out. Those aren't the same thing. She stood up and pulled her notebook from her apron pocket and sat back down across from him. Tell me everything. Not what you think matters, everything. Because I've learned in the past 6 weeks that what looks like the problem is usually the frame around the problem, and I want to see the whole frame. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then he started talking. He talked for an hour and a half. She wrote and asked questions and wrote more. And Roy came to the kitchen door at noon, and she held up one finger without looking up, and Roy, bless him, went away and came back 40 minutes later with 2 bowls of soup he'd made himself from the leftover stock, badly seasoned, too thin, but warm, and set them on the table without a word and left again. By the time Ethan was done talking, Clara had 4 pages of notes and a clearer picture of the ranch's finances than she suspected Ethan himself had held in his head at any one time. Because grief and pride and exhaustion had been sitting between him and the full picture for 3 years, and she had the advantage of seeing it fresh. The picture was hard. It was not impossible. She separated the pages into 2 groups. This group, she said, touching the first stack, is what Whitmore's recovery covers, what the Eastern herd sale covers, and what the ranch can generate in 45 days if we're aggressive about it. It's not enough. But it's not nothing. She touched the second stack. This group is what we need to close the gap. Ethan looked at the second stack. How? 3 things, Clara said. First, the Eastern herd goes to market next week, not at the end of the month. Every day we wait costs us options. The price isn't ideal right now. The price in 45 days when the bank calls the loan is worse, Clara said. We take the price we have. Ethan was quiet. All right. Second, there's a cattle buyer out of Helena named Morrison who Roy mentioned in the first week. He's been trying to negotiate a contract with Broken Pine for 2 years, and Ethan kept putting him off. I want Roy to ride to Helena tomorrow and open that conversation. Morrison wants a 5-year supply contract, Ethan said. I didn't want to lock in that long. You want to have that choice to make in 45 days, Clara said. He looked at her. Third, Clara said. She paused because the third thing was the one she'd been working toward, and she wanted to say it right. I've been writing to suppliers in Billings about the kitchen contract. 3 of them have written back. One of them, a man named Perkins. Perkins General Supply, wrote back not just about our kitchen contract. He wrote back about the possibility of a broader supply arrangement. He handles contracts for 4 other ranches in this part of the territory. He's looking for a central distribution point somewhere his wagons can stage from when they're supplying the eastern properties. Somewhere with a store building and a yard. She looked at Ethan. What's the old feed store building past the north pasture? Ethan frowned. It's been empty for 4 years. Could it hold a supply staging operation? The frown deepened, but it was a thinking frown now, not a resistant one. The roof needs work. The floor is. Roy can tell me if the structure is sound, Clara said. If it is, I want to write to Perkins and propose it. He uses the building as a staging depot. We charge him a lease. It's not enough to solve the bank problem by itself, but combined with the herd sale and the Morrison contract. Ethan was already doing the arithmetic. She could see it in his face. She let him do it. The silence in the kitchen was a working silence, the kind that had something moving through it. It might be enough, he said slowly. It might be, Clara agreed. But we have to move on all three things at once. We don't have time to be sequential. Ethan looked at the 2 stacks of paper. He looked at Clara. When did you sleep last? He said. Last night. I mean really sleep. She almost smiled. I sleep fine. You were up until past midnight 3 nights running, he said. Roy told me. Roy should tend his own hours. Ethan looked at her with something in his expression she'd some kind been fully not naming for the past several weeks. You've been carrying this ranch, he said. The kitchen, the supply investigation, Holt, the office work. And now this. The ranch needed carrying, Clara said. Not by you alone, Clara said. Roy's been here every step. Jake, the men. Ethan was quiet. Tell me what to do. Tell me specifically in order, and I'll do it. She looked at him. She thought about the first day. About the way he'd looked at her bag and her coat and her size and decided everything without opening his mouth. She thought about the food on the ground and the 20 men who went quiet and the narrow supply room and the cold stove. She thought about a man eating cold stew alone in the dark because he couldn't stand what warmth reminded him of. Start with Roy, she said. Tell Roy about the bank letter today. He needs to know, and he'll be better prepared for the Helena ride tomorrow if he understands why it matters. All right. Then send a wire to the stockyard in Billings about the eastern herd. Get a date. I can do that this afternoon. And Ethan. She held his gaze. Eat dinner with the men tonight. He blinked. You haven't sat at the table with them in months, she said. They notice. It matters more than you know. He was quiet for a long time. Margaret used to say the same thing, he said. Clara said nothing. She used to say the table was where a ranch lived or died. He looked at the table between them. Not in the pasture, not in the account books. At the table. She was right, Clara said. Ethan stood up. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it back in his coat pocket. He straightened his coat the way men do when they've made a decision and are preparing to act on it. He looked at Clara. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You can start, Clara said, by being at dinner at 6. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. He was at dinner at 6. He came in without announcement and took a seat at the long table and reached for the bread the same as any other man. And the mess hall went quiet for about 3 seconds, the particular quiet of 22 people, registering something unexpected, and then Cal said, Evening, Mr. Caldwell, and Ethan said, Evening, Cal. And then it was just dinner. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. She watched Jake Turner look up and see Ethan at the table and look over at Clara, with an expression she could read clearly from across the room, a look that was asking if she had done this and answering itself before she responded. She looked back at the stove. The soup needed another minute. She gave it its minute. Roy left for Helena the next morning before sunrise. He took the good horse and a letter Clara had drafted the night before, 3 paragraphs, formal but warm, outlining the ranch's interest in the Morrison supply contract in terms that communicated stability without lying about the current situation. She had worked on it for an hour before she was satisfied with the balance. Roy read it twice, folded it into his vest pocket, and looked at her. You write better than any cook I've ever known, he said. I've written a lot of letters, Clara said. How'd you learn? She thought about it. My mother taught me to read from the Bible and a farmer's almanac. I taught myself the rest from whatever I could get my hands on. She paused. Books teach you to write. People teach you what to write about. Roy looked at her for a moment. I'll be back by Thursday, he said. I know you will, he wrote out. Clara went back to the kitchen and made breakfast and opened the office and wrote to Perkins in Billings about the feed store building, and then she did something she had been considering for 3 days and had not yet done, which was walk to the north pasture to look at the feed store building herself. It was a 30-minute walk on a cold morning, and her coat was warm and her boots were good, and she had learned over many years not to be afraid of cold or distance. She found the building, and she stood outside it for the time it took to assess what she could assess from the outside, which was enough to know that the roofline was intact, the timber walls were solid, and the yard in front was large and flat and accessible from the main road with a good approach. She went back to the kitchen. She added a paragraph to the letter to Perkins. She sent Jake to town with it. The wire from the Billings stockyard came back that afternoon. A date 3 weeks out. The price was 15 cents below what Ethan had hoped. He came to the kitchen with the wire and showed her without speaking. "It's not. Take it," she said again. "Today's 15 cents below is better than next month's floor. Take it." He sent the confirmation wire. 2 days passed. On the third day, Gerald Holt came back to Broken Pine. This time he didn't come quietly, and he didn't come alone, and what he had with him was not a lawyer and not a deputy and not documents of any kind. He came with 4 men Clara didn't recognize and a wagon loaded with what became clear, as they pulled up in front of the main house, were crates and boxes that had the look of things being moved rather than delivered. He came with the aggressive posture of a man who had spent a week calculating and had arrived at a strategy that he believed couldn't be challenged from the position he currently occupied. Ethan was in the north pasture, Clara was in the kitchen. Jake came running from the yard and stopped in the doorway with his chest heaving. "Holt's back," he said. "He's got men in a wagon, and he's telling Cal that there's a lien on the supply building." Clara set down her spoon. "What lien?" she said. "He's saying he loaned Ethan money against the supply building 3 years ago. He's saying the loan's in default and the building is his." Clara was already moving. She untied her apron and hung it on the hook and walked out of the kitchen and across the yard to where Holt was standing in front of the main house with his 4 men and his wagon and the particular confidence of a man who has waited until his target's back is turned. Cal and 2 other ranch hands were standing between Holt and the main house steps. They weren't blocking him exactly, they were just there, which was its own form of answer. Holt saw Clara coming. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, the specific shift of a man adjusting his approach in real time. "Miss Bennett," he said, "this doesn't concern you." "Everything on this property concerns me," Clara said. She stopped 6 feet away. "What lien?" "Caldwell borrowed money from me 3 years ago against the supply building as collateral," Holt said. "I have the signed paper. The loan is past due and the interest has compounded. I'm here to take possession." "Let me see the paper," Clara said. Holt looked at her. She looked back. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out, not to Clara, to the air between them, in the specific manner of a man who expected her to have to close the distance to take it. She closed the distance and took it. She read it. She read it twice. It was a loan document with Ethan's name on it and Holt's name on it and a date 3 years prior, and at the bottom a signature that looked at first glance like Ethan's signature. She had seen Ethan's signature on the supply contracts she'd been managing for 3 weeks. She looked at this one for a long time. She looked up. "Who witnessed this?" she said. Holt blinked. "It's all there in the..." "Who witnessed it?" Clara said. "There's a witness line. The name on it." Holt's jaw moved. "Cal," Clara said, without looking away from Holt. "Go get Ethan, north pasture near the fence line. Tell him to come now." Cal was already moving. Holt took a step toward Clara. One of his men shifted behind him. "You want to think carefully," Holt low, "about what you're doing right now." "I'm looking at a document," Clara said. "That's all I'm doing." She was also, with her left hand hidden in the fold of her skirt, pressing the document flat against her leg and feeling the paper stock. It was smooth, printer smooth. Not the worn, handled quality of a document that had lived in a drawer for 3 years. She felt that for another moment. Then she looked at Holt and made sure she let nothing show on her face. Ethan arrived in 7 minutes. She knew it was 7 because she counted them, standing in the yard while Holt's men shifted and murmured, and Holt himself watched her with the calibrated attention of a man who knew something was wrong with his plan, but not yet where. Ethan came across the yard with Cal behind him and 3 other ranch hands who'd followed because they'd seen Cal's face and understood the tone of it. He stopped beside Clara and looked at Holt and then at the document in her hand. "Gerald," he said. Holt's voice was smooth again. "I'm sorry it's come to this. I gave you every opportunity to settle up. But the loan's in default and the paper's clear. The supply building is mine by right." Ethan looked at Clara. She handed him the document. He read it. He read the signature at the bottom for a long time. "I didn't sign this," he said. "Ethan, I didn't sign this, Gerald." He held it up. "This is not my signature." Holt spread his hands. "Your memory." "My memory is fine," Ethan said. "I have never borrowed money against that building. Not from anyone." His voice was flat. Not loud. The flatness of a man who has arrived at the far side of betrayal and found only cold ground there. "I know my own name." "Then you'll have no trouble demonstrating that to a judge," Holt said. He had shifted back into confidence, the recalibrated kind, the kind that knows the next move. "File a challenge. It'll take months. In the meantime, the document stands and I am entitled to take possession of the property it covers." He looked at Clara. "Unless someone interferes with that, which would be a matter for the sheriff." Clara looked at the document in Ethan's hand. She thought about what she'd felt the paper stock, the printer-smooth surface. She thought about 3 years in a drawer. She thought about something Roy had told her in the first week, almost as an aside, almost nothing, that the ranch's account ledger was kept in the desk in the main house office, and had been since Ethan's father built the place. "The ledger," she said to Ethan. He looked at her. "Your father's ledger," she said. "Does it go back far enough to cover 3 years ago?" "It goes back 20 years, Ethan said slowly. "Every transaction. Every loan, every stopped." Something moved across his face. "Every debt instrument," Clara said. "Your father kept them all." "Yes, then it will show," Clara said, "whether a loan against the supply building was recorded 3 years ago." She looked at Holt. "Because a man who makes a legitimate loan records it. The borrower records it. Both parties have documentation that matches. The ledger will show it or it won't." Holt's face had gone very still. "Get the ledger," Clara said to Ethan. Ethan went into the house. The yard was very quiet. One of Holt's men said something low, and Holt cut him off with one short word and the man went quiet again. Jake Turner was standing at Clara's left shoulder. She hadn't heard him come up. She could feel the tension in him, the particular tension of a young man who was prepared to do something physical and was waiting to be told whether that was going to be necessary. She put one hand back without looking and touched his arm very briefly. He stilled. Ethan came back with the ledger. He opened it on the porch railing and flipped pages with the practiced motion of a man who had used this book his whole life. He found the section. He read. He looked up. "There is no loan recorded," he said. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, any year, no transaction. No debt instrument. No notation of any kind related to Gerald Holt or the supply building. Holt said nothing. Clara looked at him. She thought about the paper stock. She thought about how fast that lawyer had shown up when she'd presented the invoice evidence. How fast Holt had moved after the Tuesday confrontation. How prepared he'd been. "You made this document after Tuesday," Clara said. "Not 3 years ago. After the sheriff opened the investigation. You needed something to recover from the supply overcharges, something that would tie up the ranch's assets while the investigation ran. A lien on the supply building," she paused, "which is the same building I wrote to Perkins about last week. For the staging lease." Every head in the yard turned toward her. She kept her eyes on Holt. "Someone told you about the Perkins letter," she said. Someone who knew what it was for. Someone who understood that if the staging lease came through, it would help close the gap on the bank loan. She let that sit. "Who told you?" Holt's jaw was tight. Behind her she heard a sharp intake of breath. She turned. Pete, the youngest ranch hand, barely 17, the one who'd been looking at the floor in the bunkhouse, when Holt was there, was standing at the edge of the group with a face that had gone the color of old ash. Nobody said anything. Pete looked at Clara. His voice, when it came, was barely sound. He said it would just slow things down, he said. He said nobody'd get hurt. He said he stopped. His throat worked. He paid me $2 to tell him what I heard in the kitchen. I needed my sister's sick. She needs medicine I didn't have. He stopped again. His eyes were wet. I'm sorry, Miss Bennett, I'm sorry. The yard was completely silent. Clara looked at Pete for a long time. She thought about 17. She thought about $2 and a sick sister, and the particular vulnerability of someone young and frightened, and not yet wise enough to know which debts cost more to pay than money. Pete, she said. Her voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet, which was different. Go stand with Jake. Pete moved. Jake put a hand on Pete's shoulder. Clara turned back to Holt. You used a 17-year-old boy, she said. The quiet in her voice had not changed. You used a child who needed $2 to feed his sick sister. She looked at him for one full second. I want you to understand something. That detail is going in the letter to Whitmore today. Today, not tomorrow. Holt looked at the ledger in Ethan's hand. He looked at his 4 men. He looked at 22 ranch hands who had materialized in the yard with the collective presence of men who had made a decision, without words, without signal, about which side of this they were standing on. He looked at Clara. For the first time, what was in his face was not calculation. It was something older and less controlled. She held his gaze and let him look. Then he looked away. He climbed up onto the wagon seat. His 4 men got on their horses. He drove out of the yard without speaking. The sound of the wagon wheels faded. Ethan was standing on the porch steps with the ledger in his hand and an expression that Clara could only describe as the aftermath of something, not relief exactly, not anger exactly, but the complex, exhausting territory between them where a man stands when he has finally understood the full shape of a betrayal that had been building for years. He looked at Pete. Pete was staring at the ground. Pete, Ethan said. Pete looked up. His whole body was braced. Your sister, Ethan said. Pete blinked. Sir? How sick is she? She's got a lung fever. She needs medicine from the doctor in town, but I don't. I haven't had enough. Roy will take you to town this afternoon, Ethan said. The ranch will cover the doctor. Pete stared at him. You made a bad choice, Ethan said. And we'll talk about what that means when Roy gets back from Helena. But your sister didn't make any choices and she's sick and she needs medicine. He paused. Go get your coat. Pete went. Clara stood in the yard and watched Pete disappear into the bunkhouse and felt something move through her chest that was not quite what she expected to feel after a confrontation in a yard with a forged document and a frightened 17-year-old. What she felt was something closer to certainty, that this was real, that this place was real, that these people, the men at the table, Jake with his hand on Pete's shoulder, Roy on the road to Helena, and Ethan on the porch steps talking about a sick girl's medicine in the same breath at a property dispute, were real in a way that mattered. Ethan looked at her from the porch steps. She looked back. I'll write to Whitmore, she said. Yes, he said. She went to the office. She wrote the letter detail including the stock's observation, discrepancy, the witness name, and Pete's account, in terms that were fair to Pete while being honest about what had happened. She sealed it and gave it to Cal to ride to town. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and started supper and let her hands do what they knew while her mind settled back into itself from the high, clear altitude that confrontation always put her in. She was thinking about Pete, about $2 and a sick sister, and the specific moral education a boy receives when an adult in whom he placed misplaced trust exploits the most human reason a person has for doing something wrong. She was thinking about Ethan at the dinner table, about the way the men had found their voices again around bread and soup and the particular warmth of a room where someone was paying attention. She was thinking about Roy on the road to Helena, carrying 3 paragraphs she had written at midnight, and about a feed store building with a sound roof and a flat yard, and about a letter to Perkins that might or might not arrive in time to matter. She was thinking about all of it. The kitchen door opened and Ethan came in. He sat down at the work table. Without being invited the first time, she realized that he'd come into her kitchen and sat without standing in the doorway first. She noted that. She kept cooking. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right, when you took that document from Holt," he said. "When you read it, what did you see first? What told you it was wrong?" Clara was quiet for a moment, stirring. "The paper," she said. It didn't feel like a 3-year-old document. Paper that's been handled and folded and stored has a quality to it. This felt like it came off a press last week. She paused. And then the witness. The name on the witness line, I didn't recognize it. In a legitimate document of that kind, the witness is usually someone local. Someone who can be found. The name on that paper wasn't anyone from this area. I'd have remembered if I'd heard it. Ethan was quiet. "You noticed the paper," he said. "I notice things," Clara said. "It's part of what I do, in the kitchen," he said. "In the kitchen," she agreed, "and everywhere else." He was quiet again. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had not been naming for weeks. She looked back at him without looking away and without helping him and without making it easier, because she had learned that things worth having were worth saying properly, and that a person who rushed someone toward a moment was not respecting either the moment or the person. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the first morning. About what I said to you, I know. Not just the words." He looked at the work table. "The certainty. I was so certain, and I was so completely wrong." He looked back at her. "I had a woman standing in my yard who could see things I'd missed for 3 years and run circles around a lawyer and call a forged document by feel alone, and I looked at her and saw—" He stopped. "What you expected to see," Clara said, not unkind. "Just yes. Most people do," she said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He was quiet. "I keep thinking about what I would have missed," he said. "If you'd left." Clara turned back to the stove. "But I didn't," she said. "You didn't," he said. "Why not?" She considered the question genuinely. She thought about the narrow supply room, and the cold stove, and the food on the ground, and 20 men who'd gone quiet when she asked for a chance. "Because the ranch needed someone who cared," she said. "And I was there." "That's not the whole reason," Ethan said. She stirred. "No," she said finally, "it's not." The kitchen was warm. The light was going amber through the window above the garden, where the rosemary had been cut back and was already putting out new growth at the edges. The soup was right. The bread was done. In about 20 minutes, 22 men were going to come through the door with the particular hunger of people who had earned their tiredness. Clara thought about her mother's kitchen, about the recipe notebook with the water stain, about the $11.30 and the letter from Agnes Holcomb and the $2 ride with Herbert and his gap-toothed certainty that the ranch didn't look like much. She thought about all the places she'd left because there was no reason to stay. "I stayed," she said, "because for the first time in a long time I could see what this place could be." She looked at the rosemary on the windowsill. "Not what it was. Not what it looked like the day I arrived. What it could be, if someone believed it was worth the work." Ethan was very still. "And I stay," she said, "because I was right about that." The kitchen door opened. Jake Turner stuck his head in with the uncanny timing he had for arriving at the exact edge of things without quite crossing into them. "Supper ready?" "5 minutes," Clara said. Jake looked between them. He had the perceptive young man's quick reading of a room. "I'll set the table," he said. He withdrew. Ethan stood up from the work table. He looked at Clara for a moment more. Then he said, "I'll be at the table." "I know," Clara said. He went out. She stood at the stove and felt the kitchen move around her the way it did at this hour, the heat settling, the smells layering, the sounds of the ranch shifting from the work noises of day to the slower, richer sounds of evening. She heard the mess hall filling, boots on the floor, the scrape of bench legs, Jake's voice saying something that made someone laugh. She heard Ethan's voice. Low, she couldn't make out the words, but level and warm in a way that had not been level and warm 45 days ago in this same yard. She lifted the soup pot. She carried it to the table. Whitmore's response to her letter arrived 4 days later, and it arrived with news that closed one chapter and opened another simultaneously. in the way that justice in small Montana territories tended to operate slowly and perfectly, and never quite neatly. Holt had been brought in for questioning. The forged document had been submitted for examination by a clerk with document experience, who had confirmed in writing what Clara had felt with her fingers. The paper stock was recent, the ink relatively fresh, the document not 3 years old by any physical measure. 2 of the 3 other ranches that had come forward with supply overcharges had now also produced evidence of similar loan documents, one of them already caught and challenged, the other still being investigated. Whitmore's letter said that a portion of the recovered overcharge funds, the amount Holt had moved through a second account in Billings under a different name, which the bank had now frozen, was substantially larger than originally assessed. The sheriff's estimate of what Broken Pine was owed had nearly doubled. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table with Clara across from him, because that was where they sat now when there was something that needed to be thought through, and he set it down when he finished and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "It's enough," he said. Clara had already done the math. "With the Morrison contract and the Perkins lease if both come through." "Roy telegraphed from Helena," Ethan said. "Morrison's interested. He wants to meet in person, but Roy says the tone of the conversation was strong." "And Perkins wrote back this morning," Clara said. She pulled the letter from her apron pocket. "He's sending someone to look at the feed store building next week." Ethan took the letter and read it. He read it twice. He set it next to Whitmore's letter and looked at them both side by side on the table. "My father built this ranch," he said. "He used to say that land was only as good as what you could build on it, and what you could build depended entirely on who was willing to build with you." He looked up from the letters. "I think he'd have liked you." Clara thought about what Roy had said about Margaret. She thought about the rosemary plant that had survived 14 months without tending. "I think," she said carefully, "that people who build things that last tend to recognize each other." Ethan looked at her. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the yard a horse stamped, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was playing a mouth harp badly and with great enthusiasm. And the sound of it was cheerful and completely in earnest, and entirely wrong in its notes, and completely right in everything else. "Ethan," she said. He reached across the table and set his hand next to hers. Not on it, not reaching for it, just next to it. Offering proximity without presumption, in the specific, careful manner of a man who has learned in the last 7 weeks that a woman who makes her own decisions is best met by invitation rather than assumption. Clara looked at his hand. She looked at him. She turned her hand over. Not reaching either, just there, open, available to whatever came next, in whatever time it took to come. The mouth harp in the bunkhouse hit a note. Somehow that was actually right. "From somewhere in the yard," said Cal. That almost sounded like music. And Cal's voice came back, "Don't push it." And the kitchen in the last amber light of an October evening was warm and full, and every inch of it had been earned. Roy came back from Helena on a Thursday afternoon with mud on his boots and a signed letter of intent in his pocket, and the particular expression of a man who has done something difficult and done it well, and is trying not to show how much that means to him. He walked into the kitchen without knocking, which he'd started doing about 2 weeks ago. A shift so gradual, neither of them had marked the exact moment it changed, and set the letter on the work table in front of Clara and stood back with his hat in his hands. She read it twice, she looked up. "Morrison wants the full 5-year contract," Roy said. "Ethan's price, not his." "Ethan's." Clara set the letter down carefully, the way you set down something you don't want it to damage. "Roy," she said. "I know," he said, "this covers." "I know what it covers," he said. "I did the arithmetic on the ride back." Twice. He looked at his hat. "It's going to be all right, isn't it?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Clara said, "it's going to be all right." Roy put his hat back on. He cleared his throat. He walked out. Clara stood at the work table with the Morrison letter, and Perkins' letter, and Whitmore's letter all in front of her. 3 pieces of paper that together told a story she had not known she was writing when she climbed off Herbert's buckboard 7 weeks ago with $11.30 in a worn recipe notebook. She thought about the first morning, the cold stove, the food on the ground, the narrow supply room. Then she picked up all 3 letters and walked to the main house and knocked. Ethan opened the door. She held out the letters. He looked at her face before he looked at them. He took them. She watched him read, and she watched his face move through the arithmetic the same way Roy's had, and then go still, and then do something she had seen it, do only a handful of times in 7 weeks it opened. The particular careful closure he carried most hours. The thing that had been there since before she arrived, and that grief and betrayal and the weight of it in ranch, had built layer by layer over years it opened. Just briefly, just enough. He looked up. "Come in," he said. She came in. They sat at the table, his table, the same table where Fitch had spread his papers, and Whitmore had taken his notes, and Holt had sat with his whiskey and his long-running scheme, and they went through the numbers together for the last time, combining the 3 letters with the bank statement and the stockyard confirmation in the ledger, and when they were done, the picture was not perfect. It never was. There were still years of careful management ahead, still debts to retire on schedule, still the hard work of rebuilding what the drought and the bad seasons and Holt's long quiet theft had taken from the property. But the ranch would not be sold, the bank would be paid. The land would stay. Ethan set down his pen, he looked at the table. "I need to tell you something," he said. Clara waited. "When Margaret died," he said, "I made a decision. Not out loud, I didn't say it. I didn't even think it clearly. But I made it." He was looking at the table, not at her. "I decided the ranch was all I had left worth keeping, and I was going to hold on to it, and I was going to do it alone, and I wasn't going to let anything in that might." He stopped. "That might make losing it worse." The kitchen was quiet through the wall. "And then you showed up," he said. He looked at her. "And you wouldn't leave," he said, "and the food was right. And the men came back to the table. And you found the thing Roy couldn't find because nobody gave him the framework." The corner of his mouth moved. "Your words." "My words," Clara agreed. "And I kept waiting," he said, "for the moment when I'd be glad I hadn't let you in. The moment that would prove I'd been right to be careful." He paused. It didn't come. Clara looked at him steadily. "Ethan," she said. "I know I'm not easy," he said. I know what I looked like on that first day. What I was. I saw it," she said. "And you stayed, I stayed." He looked at her. "I don't want you to stay because the ranch needs you," he said. "The ranch does need you, that's true. But that's not." He stopped again. He was working at this the way she'd seen him work at difficult things, with patience and without grace, pressing through the resistance because he'd decided the other side was worth reaching. "I need you, Clara. I need you specifically and entirely separately from everything else." The room was very still. Clara looked at the man across the table from her. She thought about $11.30. She thought about Agnes Holcomb's 3-sentence letter, and the buckboard ride, and the mud rut yard, and the cold stove. She thought about all the places she'd left, and all the doors that had closed behind her, and all the years she'd spent understanding that leaving was sometimes survival, and that staying was a different kind of courage entirely. She thought about turning her hand over on this same table 4 days ago. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know you do," she said. "I've known for a while." She held his gaze. "And I need you to hear something." "All right. I didn't stay for you," she said. "Not at first. I stayed because I could see what this place could be, and I wanted to be part of building it. And I stayed because these men deserved someone in their corner. And I stayed because the work was worth doing." She paused. "But I also stayed, somewhere in the back of everything, because of the way you ate that stew." He blinked. "The first night," she said. "I found out from Roy. You came into the kitchen and set the bowl down and left, and then you went back to the main house and ate it cold and alone in the dark." She watched his face. "Because you couldn't stand what warmth reminded you of. But you ate it anyway." She paused. "A man who eats cold stew in the dark because he can't stop himself from needing something that's a man worth knowing." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Roy talks too much," he said. "Roy loves this ranch," Clara said, "and he loves the people in it." That Ethan was quiet. "Clara," he said. "Will you, I mean to say," he stopped. He looked at the table. He looked back at her. I am asking you, plainly, if you would be willing to let this become something between us, in whatever form and at whatever pace you decide is right. She looked at him. Yes, she said, I would. The word sat between them with the particular weight of things that are simple and enormous simultaneously. It was a long breath. Good, he said. Good, Clara agreed. From the yard outside they heard Jake Turner's voice rise in an argument with Cal about the correct way to rehang a gate. And Cal's voice come back with the dry assurance of a man who has rehung 40 gates and will rehang 40 more without asking a 19-year-old's opinion on the matter. And the ordinary music of the ranch, going about its ordinary work, filled the space between them and around them, and it was exactly right. The Perkins man came the following Tuesday. His name was Edward Toll, and he was a compact, precise man in his 40s who walked the feed store building with a measuring tape and a notebook and asked questions that told Clara he knew what he was looking for and would not be satisfied by anything less. She walked the building with him herself, answering questions about load capacity and road access and the water situation and the distance to the main road, and he wrote everything down. And when they were done, he stood in the yard and looked at the building for a long moment. The roof needs work, he said. Yes, Clara said. We know. Ethan has a crew ready to start this week if the lease terms come through. Toll looked at her. You're the supply manager? I am. He looked at the building again. Perkins said the woman who wrote the proposal had a clear head for logistics. He paused. He was right. Clara said nothing. We'll have terms to you by end of next week, Toll said. He rode back to town. Jake Turner, who had been visibly within earshot the entire time, came around the corner of the feed store building with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was trying hard to be neutral. End of next week, he said. That's what he said. Is that good? That's very good, Clara said. That means yes. Lord, go tell Roy. Roy's going to cry. Roy is not going to cry, Clara said. Roy, when Jake told him, did not cry. He sat very still at the bunkhouse table for about 20 seconds, and then said all right then, in a voice that was somewhat thicker than usual, and went outside to check something on the fence line. That night at dinner, 22 men and Ethan Caldwell sat together at the long table. And the meal was not more elaborate than any other night. Beef and potatoes and bread and a dried fruitcake Clara had made, because she had the time and the supplies and the inclination, but something in the room that night was different from any other night, even the good ones. It was the first night the ranch felt like it had a future. Not a maybe future, not a fighting for it future, an actual solid built thing future that would still be standing next year and the year after. Cal felt it. She could tell by the way he sat easier, less braced. Jake felt it. He kept looking around the table like he was trying to memorize it. Pete, still on the ranch, still working, having sat through a long and serious conversation with Ethan and Roy about choices and consequences and second chances, the outcome of which had left him quieter and more careful and considerably more grown than he'd been the week before Pete ate his dinner with his head up for the first time in days. Ethan sat at the head of the table and said little, but he was present in a way he hadn't been for a long time, not just physically, but all the way present, looking at the room and the men and the meal with the eyes of a man who has remembered what he's working for. He looked at Clara once across the room. She looked back. That was all. It was enough. The news about Holt came from Whitmore 12 days later. Formal charges filed in the county court. Fraud, forgery, and deliberate contract manipulation across 6 properties over a period of 4 years. The document examiner's report was part of the filing, citing Clara's paperstock observation as the initial trigger for the physical examination. Whitmore's letter to Ethan mentioned this specifically, and Ethan read that part aloud to Clara at the kitchen table and then looked at her over the letter. You're cited in a formal court filing, he said. I noticed the papers, she said. They didn't, he said. For 4 years nobody did. Clara poured coffee. She thought about what it meant not in terms of courts and filings, and the official record, though those things mattered. She thought about what it meant for the ranches, the other 6 properties. The other families who had been paying inflated prices and taking on debt they didn't understand the source of and watching their margins shrink without knowing why. The other ranches, she said. Do you know them? Two of them, Ethan said. The Harker family south of here. And the Bryants, they've got a spread near the river. I know Bill Bryant fairly well. They'll need help, Clara said. Sorting through their records, building the case for what they're owed. Ethan looked at her. Are you offering? He said. I'm saying they'll need it, Clara said. And I know how to do it now, if they want help. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. People helped me, she said quietly. Roy helped me. Jake helped me. You helped me eventually. She looked up. It doesn't feel right not to pass that along. Ethan set the letter down on the table. I'll write to Bill Bryant this afternoon, he said. And the Harkers, he agreed. He was looking at her with the expression she'd stopped trying not to name. You came here to cook, he said. I did. And you've ended up. He gestured a general motion that took in the kitchen and the letters on the table and presumably the entire changed condition of the ranch. All of this I cooked, Clara said. Everything else followed from that. Ethan said. Everything else followed from you. He paused. There's a difference. The first snow came in the third week of November, light and early, just enough to put a skin of white on the yard and the pasture rooftops. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway in the early morning and watched it and thought it the first time she'd stood in this doorway. October, the kitchen cold, the smokeless chimney. 7 weeks. It felt like longer, in the way that time feels longer when a great deal has happened within it. She had lived a year in those 7 weeks, in the specific sense of having done a year's worth of mattering to people, which was the only kind of time she'd ever been able to measure reliably. Jake Turner came up behind her and stood at the kitchen doorway looking at the snow. Think it'll stick, he said. Not today, Clara said. It'll warm up by noon. Roy says it's going to be a hard winter. Roy says that every year. Jake was quiet for a moment. Is it true you're going to help the Harker family with their records? Ethan's arranging it. And the Bryants. Yes, Jake thought about that. That's a lot of extra work. It is. You don't have to do it. I know I don't have to, Clara said. Jake looked at the snow on the yard. My mother used to do that, he said. Take on extra work for people who needed it. Even when she didn't have much herself. He paused. She said it was the only honest answer to having been helped. Clara looked at the snow. She thought about a young man eating hardtack for breakfast. About a bowl of beef stew and a face that remembered what home felt like. Your mother was right, she said. Jake was quiet. Then he said Miss Bennett, she said. She'd told him that 3 weeks ago. He kept forgetting or pretending to. Clara, he said. I'm glad you stayed. She looked at him. He was looking at the snow with the studied casualness of someone who has said a vulnerable thing and is managing the aftermath. He nodded once. He went inside to eat breakfast. Clara stayed in the doorway a moment longer. She looked at the white yard and the smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney and the gray sky going pale at the edges where the sun was beginning to push through. She looked at the kitchen garden where the rosemary was still green under its thin coat of snow, the roots deep enough that a Montana winter would not touch them. Then she went inside and made breakfast. The morning Ethan proposed was not a dramatic morning. It was December, a Tuesday, and the feed store building had been officially leased to Perkins Supply for 8 months, and the first Morrison cattle delivery had gone out, and the bank payment had been made on time, and the ranch was, for the first time in 6 years, operating at a small but definite surplus. Clara was in the office reviewing the December supply orders when Ethan knocked on the open door, which he always did even though the door was already open, because he had learned somewhere in the past 2 months to knock. She looked up. He was holding something small. He came in and stood on the other side of the work table and set it on the surface between them. It was a ring, simple, with a small turquoise stone. Old, it had the quality of a thing that had been kept carefully for a long time. It was my mother's, he said. Margaret had her own. My mother gave me this one when I was married, said to keep it, Said I'd know when the right time was. He looked at the ring on the table. I kept it in the desk for 20 years because I never quite believed that. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at Ethan. I'm not a simple man to be with, he said. I know that. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes and be proud when I should be humble and slow when I should be fast, and you're going to know better than me about more things than I'm comfortable with. He paused. But I'm going to spend every year trying to deserve having you here. That I know how to promise. Clara was quiet. She thought about all the things she was and all the things she'd been told she wasn't. She thought about the weight she'd carried her whole life in a world that looked at her body and made decisions about her value. She thought about kitchens that had welcomed her, and kitchens that hadn't, and the specific courage it took to walk into the ones that hadn't and prove them wrong one meal at a time. She thought about a ring that had been kept in a desk for 20 years by a man who didn't believe in the right time until he met the right person. She picked up the ring. It fit. Not perfectly, she'd have to have it sized, but close enough that it sat on her finger with the intention of belonging there. Yes, she said. Ethan looked at her hand. He exhaled. Good, he said. You already used that word, Clara said. The first time. It was the right word then, he said. It's the right word now. She almost smiled. He came around the side of the work table, and he was careful about it. And when he was close enough, he lifted his hand and touched her face, one careful, deliberate motion, the back of his fingers against her cheek, and she let him. And it was not a grand gesture, and it was not a dramatic one, and it was the truest thing that had happened in that office, or possibly in that whole ranch, since she had arrived with her bag and her notebook and her refusal to leave. Clara Bennett, he said. Ethan Caldwell, she said. They stood like that for a moment. Then from outside, somewhere in the vicinity of the supply barn, there was a loud crash followed by Jake Turner's voice, saying a word that he absolutely should not have said in the vicinity of the main house. Followed by Cal's voice saying, I told you to use 2 hands. Followed by the unmistakable sound of 20 feet of lumber hitting a frozen yard. Ethan and Clara looked at each other. That's the roofing timber for the east pasture shed, Ethan said. Is it ruined? Not. He paused. Probably. Clara untied her office apron and hung it on the hook. Come on, she said. They walked out together. The yard was cold and bright, and Jake was standing in the middle of a scattered pile of lumber, with the expression of a man preparing a very thorough explanation, and Cal was standing with his arms crossed, waiting to hear it, and 3 other ranch hands were watching with the interest of people who know they are not the one in trouble and are enjoying the distinction. Jake looked up when they came out. He looked at Clara's hand. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the ring. He opened his mouth. Don't, Ethan said. I wasn't going to say Jake. Jake closed his mouth. He looked at Clara. Something moved across his face, something young and real and entirely unperformed, the expression she'd first seen over a bowl of stew on the first night, the one that looked like a person remembering what home felt like. He nodded once, slow and certain. She nodded back. Cal looked between all of them, and then at the lumber on the ground, and said, with the magnificent indifference of a man who has seen enough of life not to be distracted from the immediate problem, Are we going to stack that timber, or are we going to stand here? They stacked the timber. All of them, including Ethan, including Clara, working together in the December so cold, with their breath coming in white clouds and the yard frozen hard underfoot. And by the time the timber was stacked and secured, Pete had come out from the barn to help, and Roy had appeared from somewhere with a length of rope, and the thing was done in 20 minutes and better done than if the lumber had never fallen. Because the stack was properly tied now, instead of just balanced. Roy stood and looked at the stack. He looked at Clara's hand. He looked at Ethan. He said nothing for a long time. About time, he said. Roy, Ethan said. I've been watching you circle each other for 2 months, Roy said pleasantly. I'm just saying, you could not say. I could, Roy agreed. But it wouldn't be honest. Cal said. I knew it by the end of the first week. Nobody asked you, Cal, Ethan said. Also not saying anything, Jake said, with an enormous amount of visible effort. Clara laughed. The sound of it moved through the cold yard, real, unguarded, the kind of laughter that happens when something is genuinely funny, and you are genuinely happy, and the two things arrive at the same moment. She felt it all the way through, and she felt the cold yard and the stacked lumber and the men around her and Ethan beside her, and all of it was real, every molecule of it. None of it borrowed or temporary or contingent on being someone other than who she was. She was Clara Bennett. She was large and warm, and she noticed things other people missed, and she could fix a stove flue with baling wire, and read a forged document, the feel of the paper, and make 22 exhausted men remember what it meant to sit at a table together. She had come to Broken Pine with $11.30 and a worn recipe notebook and the refusal to be sent away, and she had done everything she'd come to do and then considerably more. And none of it, not a single piece of it, had required her to be smaller than she was. She stood in the December yard with a ring on her finger that fit close enough, and a man beside her who had learned to knock, and men around her who had learned to stay at a table and a ranch under their feet that was going to be standing next year and the year after that. The cold was clean and sharp, and the smoke was banked from the kitchen chimney, because she had banked the fire before coming out, and the fire kept because she had learned this stove's particular character and what it needed. The way she had learned everything she'd needed to learn here, not because it was easy, but because she had stayed long enough for it to matter. Clara Bennett had ridden into Broken Pine, Montana territory, on a broken sky morning in October with everything she owned and a hope she had not fully let herself name. She had been judged before she opened her mouth, dismissed before she opened her bag, told she did not belong, before she had been given a single honest chance. She had stayed anyway. She had worked anyway. She had seen the ranch for what it could be when everyone else was only seeing what it was. And she had bent her whole self toward that vision with the specific, unglamorous, daily courage of someone who has never had the luxury of waiting to be invited. And now on a Tuesday in December, with lumber on the ground and Roy saying about time, and Jake Turner nodding his slow, certain nod, and Ethan Caldwell standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, the ranch was what she had seen it could be. Not because the world had finally decided she deserved it. Not because someone had looked at her and changed his mind about what her body meant about her worth. But because she had never, not once in 7 weeks, allowed anyone else's small vision of her to become her own. The ranch lived. The table was full. The woman nobody had wanted in their kitchen had become the heart of everything that mattered. And the greatest thing, the truest thing, the thing that would outlast the bank payments, and the supply contracts and the legal filings and every practical structure they had built together, was not what she had saved. It was that she had never stopped believing it was worth saving. That was Clara Bennett. That was enough. That was everything.